Kyle here from All Media Reviews, here to talk about. I'm not going to do a CD A to Z just now. Maybe if I have time in a little bit, I will. But the 2025 Rock and Roll Hall of Fame nominations came out today. Today's February 12th, 2025. Just to go over it, and I do this I've done this. I don't know how many times. I did it in the blog two, three, four times maybe different years, maybe more than that. And I had more. I had at least four entries about the Rock Hall in there. Probably more than that. Probably closer, like more like a dozen rants per se, exactly, of course. And then on YouTube, I've done. I think I've maybe made at least three of them, maybe more than that. I made a couple like after the results and stuff, but anyway, so this is like an annual or semi-annual or every 2 years. It's become kind of an annual tradition per se, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. So there are 14 names nominated. One of my biggest contentions, as I've said, is that one of the biggest problems is the backlog because they're including so many different time frames of how recently an artist was or band or artist was eligible, and then just people that haven't that should be in. Vice, of course, there's certain genre like jazz I've talked about. If you're gonna, they didn't really have any country this year, but if you're gonna have rap slash hip hop, you really need to have jazz. But all you got is Miles Davis. You don't have John Coltrane. You don't have any other. And Herbie Hancock would be obvious. He had a crossover hit in Rocket in the '80s. But 14 is, it's a little more than they've had at points. But like last year, I guess they had six. They inducted 16. Now that's also including the categories or early influence and musical excellence and the other those different categories. But my overall thought is that 14 is not enough. It's better than it used to be a few years back, but it's not enough. But I'll go over them as quickly or not so quickly as possible. But I'm just my impression though, looking at the list before going over it, it's kind of blah. It's kind of nondescript for the most part. There's not any sort of big, massive, iconic names that really need to be in there that you've been waiting for or hoping would finally show up in the ballot. So, all right, I'll just go over it. I'm going to go over it and then I'll make some comments about them. Bad Company, The Black Crowes, Mariah Carey, Chubby Checker, Joe Cocker, Billy Idol, Joy Division slash New Order, Cyndi Lauper, Mana, Oasis, Outcast, Fish, the PH Fish, not the singer from Marillion, Soundgarden, and the White Stripes. Yeah, it's not like these artists, I think a lot of them weren't being in the Rock Hall, especially since certain things have opened with like rap and hip hop, especially in pop acts. But so here's my take on some of this stuff. So Bad Company. Um, they're okay, but there's other artists that are more influential and important. And also, when you're putting in Bad Company or you're nominating, if you put Bad Company in, you really need to consider Free. It's that whole dilemma of the Guess Who and Bachman Turner Overdrive. Now, they're to skip down to make a comment about the Joy Division slash New Order hybrid nomination, combination, hybrid combination nomination. Weird way to say it. Those were like all the same members except Ian Curtis, I guess, that formed New Order. I guess that's their argument. I say baloney. You know, put in Paul Rogers, and then because they put in George Michael, they talked about his Wham music. You know, you're kind of shortchanging half of Paul Rogers' career if you're doing Bad Company. It's a little like the Clapton thing, or David Crosby. It's like every one of their little bands have to be in. Um, but yeah, I don't hate Bad Company, but I feel like it's the token classic rock selection. It's like they got their one in. The people that are on the committee and the people that they're voting, and basically the people on the committee and like the voters and the backlash comments. We're so sick of it. We're gonna put all the dad rock bands, all the classic. The problem is there are so many of them, and by only nominating one, first of all, no guarantee they even get in. But if they get in, there's so many others you're still not getting in. They're going to start putting all of them into musical excellence or early influence because I don't hate Bad Company. They're okay, I guess. I listen to them on KQRS, the home of rock and roll in Minneapolis, St. Paul. Um, they had that song "Smoke Without a Fire" that I have the cassette single from, but I think by putting them in, they decide they're not going to nominate your Styxes, your Super Tramps. Um, even I'd put, yeah, I mean the Guess Who and BTO and that whole thing with the Guess Who reputation with the people with Rolling Stone and the Rock Hall in general. Even though Jan Wenner is not on the nomination committee or the board anymore, but his influence is still being felt. That whole thing, I just think there's many artists that haven't been nominated that Grand Funk Railroad even. But I'm like just not like terribly upset that they're nominated, but it's like I just feel like they're third tier, secondary in terms of priority. And then the progressive stuff, even you put Kansas on that list too. But I mean, even the AOR stuff because they're kind of filling that little slot as well. I mean, REO Speedwagon is a bigger name than them actually. So anyway, the Black Crowes, this one is kind of puzzling, and I'm a fan of the Black Crowes, mainly their first couple records. And I guess they got back together recently. The two brothers, the Robinson brothers, were at odds rather, which is nice, but I just think it's like it feels like Jane's Addiction almost. It's like they got a little more music and a little I don't know than Jane's Addiction, but to draw upon their history. I I think they're mostly like a late '80s, early '90s band. I think of them most for, and there are bands from that era and before them that they could nominate instead. But I mean, if they got in, I'd be kind of happy for them. But I know they have like connections with like Jellyfish too. From the Jellyfish, I think Roger Manning was like friends with the Robinsons. But anyway, I'm surprised they got nominated. I mean, there's other artists think of like XTC even, but I mean, even like more well-known artists that could have been nominated instead of them. But Mariah Carey, well, she's the token like pop icon. She got nominated. I think it was year before. I think it was last year. I think, given the way that this lineup is, she's got a pretty damn good chance to get in. If you're putting in George Michael, you're putting in Whitney Houston, you're putting in Janet Jackson for that matter, and Madonna, Mariah is naturally the one. You should be putting her in before the likes of Britney Spears and like Christina Aguilera at some point and Beyonce. She's got to go in before those. And the thing is, those people are going to come up. Britney's already eligible. I think both her and Christina are eligible, but so I hope she gets in. She deserves to get in from a pop standpoint. I know people are gonna like hate on it that the whole purist and the rock, but we kind of have gotten used to that. It's like they're gonna. So I'm glad she got nominated. My wife's a fan. That also kind of helps. So she's the biggest pop act of the '90s. So Chubby Checker, it's nice to see his name on the ballot. He's way overdue per se. He's been eligible for 30 plus years. He's in his early 80s now. And among the early rock and roll artists that are even still alive, he's one of the only ones left. Um, do I think he's going to get in on the ballot? Kind of doubt it. And I'm pretty sure he will not be voted in. I could be wrong, but just my guess is that he's too obscure of a name. He's known for the song The Twist, of course. That's his biggest, claim. But I think him and one of the other names on here, the one I'm about to talk about, both could end up being put in under the probably the early influence if they don't get in just because I think they were on the ballot for that reason, which in a way kind of feels bad because they're taking up a spot for someone else. But if he gets in one way or the other, more likely through like that's good to see. I don't have anything against Chubby Checker, and among given that his era he comes from, and it's well overdue, but I guess better late than never for some artists. Joe Cocker, similar to Chubby Checker in that he probably should have been nominated a long time ago. I'm not a huge fan. Of course, we know his cover of the Beatles "Will Help from My Friends." That Jennifer Warren's song that got the Grammy, "Up Where We Belong." He had his share of like songs that were popular. That were like covers of other songs, standards, that was more. He was like a little bit like Linda Ronstadt or Pat Boone in a way, in that sense. I again think I'd be surprised if he got voted in. If he got voted in by the fans, and I'd be surprised. He's like Warren Zevon in a way. Be surprised if he got voted in, but maybe he'll get put in through the early influence or the musical excellence category. He was the first artist who ever performed at First Avenue as First Avenue, I believe, back in like it was like the mid '70s, something like that, 73, 74. Billy Idol, he's more of an '80s new wave punk act. Is like Elvis for the '80s. It's like the glam Elvis sort of. Um, don't love him. Don't really hate him that much. I mean, I don't. I guess he had his cover of Moni Moni was like everywhere, every dance party, and it's like would play it at like sporting events. So his claim to fame, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, he has a relative amount of fame, although I think he's more famous with Gen X, like my generation, and people that were around in the '80s and '90s. I don't think Gen Z and a lot of millennials really know him that well. Maybe they know Billie Eilish, and they probably saw his name when Billie Eilish got popular. But I could take or leave if he. I mean, again, it's more of that he's being nominated, whereas people like Phil Collins and um, Huey Lewis, the News are not. That's where my kind of biggest beef is in excess. Why he's being nominated instead of others, but I don't like discount the fact if he got in, I wouldn't have as much of a problem with compared to some other people that have gotten in. Joy Division, New Order, hipsters, yeah, they influenced the whole new wave and post punk genre and a lot of electronic like that whole genre that the hipsters want to champion this band. They're basically like the Velvet Underground for the '80s. Um, I'd like to see them get in so we don't have to hear about them constantly. That would be it. Their music is okay. I like Depeche Mode much better. They came later, of course, but I think it's just sort of a changing, like moving the goalposts, cop out where they're combining the two and they're not doing that with others that need to. The same thing could be done with, but it's fine. I mean, if they don't get in, I don't won't be upset at all. If they got in, fine. Cyndi Lauper, while she was nominated a couple years ago, the same year that George Michael got in, George Michael was more important and he got in justifiably. She was really close, and I do like some of her music. I'm not big in it. I've gotten a little burnt out on it recently. Listened to a lot of the Casey Kasem, and they played on the radio stations we listened to. Her 4, 5, 6 big hits from the '80s, but I like her. I like that she champions the LGBTQ community. She was somewhat iconic, although I don't see her at the same. She wasn't in the same category as obviously Prince or Madonna. Madonna's the obvious comparison, or Michael Jackson, or probably even George Michael. But she was kind of in that next group, and her, time after time, and her cover of "Girls Just Want to Have Fun" were pretty iconic. Um, I think that what they used time after time, I think in Napoleon Dynamite maybe, but yeah, I'd like to see her get in. I know that there's that campaign that was really championing her in every different area, trying to get every town to vote for her. I think she will get in because it's her second time, because she's maybe even become more visible the last couple of years since the last nomination, and I think largely because of this sort of second tier impression from this of the nominees, this roster. So I hope she gets in. I hope she will. Mana. Who are you? I've never heard of your band. From doing a little research, started in the late '80s and we're in the '90s. Rock and Espanol. All right, but this is the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Your name's going to be on the ballot. You're taking up a spot that someone else could have had that is more famous in my mind. I don't know who nominated them and how they got enough support. But I also believe they sing in Spanish. They're from Mexico. They might be. Why wouldn't you have Los Lobos? Los Lobos was nominated before. Los Lobos is more famous than them, and they actually predate them, I believe, by maybe a couple years. But they haven't brought Los Lobos back on the ballot. For that matter, the Mavericks. The Mavericks had music that were in Tarantino movies. So, um, but yeah, I think this one is the biggest head scratcher. I mean, Who are they? Not people know who. I mean, people didn't know who Fela Kuti. I knew who Fela Kuti was, but it'd be like if not Procol Harum, something like think of a band that had a cult following, but that really like if Climax got nominated or someone like that. Like who? But this band, yeah, I mean, I don't know. I we'll see. I'd be surprised that many people will vote for them, but whatever. They have to fill that little extra category. I was listening to the Rock Hall, the Hall Watchers podcast. They were saying that what the Rock Hall should do is add a category for international acts, which is fine. But what about like so? In Excess is from Australia. Are they international? They would be. Anyone from Canada? I don't know. Anyway, Oasis. They're basically the next level of Nirvana and Green Day, sadly, Pearl Jam for that matter. Um, and Radiohead to some degree. It was almost inevitable they're going to get nominated and get in. It's just, even though I know they reunited the two guys are not the Gallagher brothers. They're at war, although they reunited, so some things changed a little bit in the last year or two. Um, they're just not the greatest people. Of course, Noel I think co-wrote the song on the last Monkeys album, but not the last one, but the Good Times, the song that I like the most, Birth of Accidental Hipster. But I mean, they were '90s darlings, but I didn't care about them. I said this last year. I think Blur was better. I don't like Blur that much, but between the two of them, I think Blur was better. Oasis was more famous, I guess, but it was kind of splitting hairs. People that love Blur probably like Gorillaz instead of Blur, but whatever. I guess they might get in. I could see them getting in because people just know them. They know Wonderwall, of course. Anyway, Outcast. My wife is a little bit of a fan. They had a pretty profound or pretty apparent influence on the likes of on many artists, but especially Janelle Monáe. Um, I like Andre 3000. I like both. Big Boy was on Janelle's, her debut full length, The Arcandroid. Um, yeah, I mean, there was another case where it was I don't listen to pop music, MTV. I didn't watch TRL in the late '90s and early 2000s when they were peaking, but they became this pretty big popular artist. I'd heard the name a couple times, but it really wasn't until maybe about 15 years ago I knew who they really were. I mean, I heard their music, I guess you could say. Um, I kind of think that there's a good chance they'll get in because they have a massive following and people will vote for them. They had a few crossover singles, so which is fine. But if they didn't get in, I wouldn't be upset though. But so moving on, Fish, PH. Having Dave Matthews Band get in, last year made sense. I think Fish should have gone in before them because they predate Dave Matthews and they're better. Not that I'm a really much of a fan, although I've always wanted to spend a little time with the early Fish albums because they're progressive rock, they're Genesis influence because they're a big fan of Genesis and they always wanted to try having Peter Gabriel, sing with them and do the complete Lamb. Never happened. Unlike Halloween. Yeah, I mean, I think it like Dave Matthews, there's a chance that their fan base will flood and they could win the fan vote. Um, the average like voter probably knows their name better than they know their music. They have that single bounce around the room, of course. But I don't know. I think there's a good chance they get in. If they get in, they're the only act really on here. It's even just slightly related to progressive rock, which is kind of pathetic. But if they don't get in, they'll probably get nominated again. Eventually, will. I think it's inevitable. I don't know if bands like Government Mule and Mo and some of those other bands, the jam bands per se, will ever get in. Humphreys McGee, I kind of doubt it, but it would take them to get in for those bands to even have a chance. Um, Soundgarden, this is what their third nomination. They need to get in. I think that especially they're a classic case like some of these other like the MC5 and Link Ray and Shaka Khan and LL Cool J and Judas Priest, where if they don't get in this year, they're going to be put in they'll be put in. And they were the third biggest grunge band. I mean, they're not metal really. But if they get in, then some of these other bands will probably get on the ballot, like Alice in Chains, and the one that I keep seeing people that don't mention is Smashing Pumpkins. Maybe even Stone Temple Pilots. The Smashing Pumpkins exactly grunge. Well, they weren't from Seattle, but um, the whole thing with Chris Cornell, the martyr per se. Yeah, I mean it's been enough time since he passed away. You don't have to like think of it. They're putting Soundgarden in because he passed away, but I mean, from a standpoint of the nomination list, they're the only band that's sort of even close to metal, but they're not metal. Um, but I hope they get in because then we don't have to keep on hearing about them every year. It's like them and Joy Division, New Order, especially those two, um, and even Mariah. The White Stripes, the same thing kind of holds true. They're the one name on this list that I probably actively dislike. Um, I don't like their music. Seven Nation Army is annoying. And I didn't like, like I said that Jack. Why was Jack White on that? It might get loud when they could have had someone like Omar Rodriguez Lopez or something like that. But um, yeah, I think it's inevitable. Like the Radiohead thing, I think them and Oasis. I don't say actively dislike, but I kind of want those two and even Soundgarden to get in, so we don't have to hear about them being nominated and people whining that they're not in. But I can probably contend, depending on who would induct them, they get in and like Oasis gets in. I'll be tuning out of the ceremony, putting the remote on mute or whatever on the stream on mute. Um, but the whole reunion, well, you want to get them back together, just like these. Like you have a reunion from Black Crowes, you have a reunion from Oasis the last couple of years. The White Stripes could have their reunion, of course, too. But so, yeah, it's. I mean, it's to me, it's like a B level list. Names that yeah, a lot of them probably should be in, given that they put in some of the other acts, other performers that they have put in. But there's no like bands that we want to get in. This list of In Excess and the prog bands, King Crimson, Jethro Tull, um, ELP, Emerson Lake and Palmer, Kansas, Supertramp, the Guess Who, Boston, um, Styx. All these bands are not being considered instead of that. That's my biggest reaction. And then like Phil Collins, the pop acts from the '80s, you know, he's not super old, but that documentary you think would have helped him. Um, I know he's in with Genesis, but that shouldn't mean they put Ozzy in last year, because he was in with Black Sabbath. No metal. You didn't have Iron Maiden. You didn't have Motorhead. You didn't have Megadeth. You didn't have Faith No More. You know, I'm sure Tom Morello was still fighting for Iron Maiden, but he should be fighting for Faith No More because Faith No More should have gone in before his band Rage Against the Machine. He'd probably even agree with that. Um, there's a lot of still acts from the '80s, especially. There's some '70s, but also, and then of course my biggest beef. I didn't even gone 30 some minutes now talking. No Monkeys. Now maybe we'll see them show up in the musical excellence category, maybe even early influence. But every year Monkeys are the most important one until they get in, until they get nominated. Because if they get nominated, I believe they will just get in. I think the fan base will probably it'd be like Rush or Kiss, but it's the same thing every year. It's going to be in L.A., I guess, but if the Monkeys were to be put in for musical excellence, my wife and I would have to think about going. Even though we didn't go see George Michael, especially out in L.A., even though they had everything that happened with the fires there. New York is a bit more of a cluster bleep about paying for a hotel and um, more crowded, I guess you could say. Although LA is crowded too. I don't know. I don't know if I doubt it's going to happen. But if it were to happen that way, we find out in a couple. It's going to be April, the last week of April, I guess. But we would probably go. My wife, I mean, she's got some other artists she kind of likes that could get in at some point. The names on this list that she likes are like Mariah and maybe Outkast, but she probably doesn't really care that much about any other names on this list. So if they don't have anyone on the list for musical excellence, there's no way we're gonna go unless we got like free tickets or something. So Yeah, I mean, I should go over more in depth the list of names that like a top. I should come up with like a top 50. I could do 50. I could just do top 30. Top 30 names rank. I could do a pub meeple of artists that are not in that should be in the Rock Hall. I mean, it may be front loaded with progressive rock and metal, but it wouldn't be entirely. But anyway, I might want to include Olivia Newton-John because putting these pop acts in with the likes of Janet and Whitney and now Mariah probably, you know, how many pop hits, how many number ones did Olivia Newton-John have in the 70s and early 80s? She had top 10. She probably had like 8, 9, 10. Her and Phil Collins both. Pop charts and Streisand actually. But they weren't putting pop acts in the 90s and 2000s much at all. So, that's why it took forever for even Madonna to get. Michael Jackson crossed over so much. Prince isn't really a pop act. He did some pop songs, but he's a funk and R&B and rock artist. But he's probably more rock than pop. Michael Jackson at least had Eddie Van Halen playing the solo on Beat It, and he appealed to the rocks, and then he'd gotten in with the Jackson 5 also. It kind of was a no-brainer to put him in, even though he was the king of pop. But they're kind of doing more pop stuff now. That's why it's ridiculous that some of these pop acts that had tons of hits, Olivia Newton-John, Phil Collins, are not in, and you're putting in the ones from now. You're going to put Britney and Beyonce at some point, and Taylor Swift at some point. The way it is, it's the way, I mean, we need change. We need more nominations and more inductees. Um, and they did change some of them. We need the nomination committee to continue to have term limits and have people often. Some of them did leave, and there's some new people. There were the people on the Hall Watchers were saying that the Fish nomination is a sign that someone new came in. I forget the guy's name, but that, and then we need the fan vote. That's actually almost the biggest point of contention because that wouldn't be that hard to do. The fan vote needs to be worth more than one vote. It needs to be worth 1/3. I've said this for going on 7, 8, 9 years. So thank you for watching though, and we'll see you next time.